The east wing of Asheville Manor smelled like old paper and slow time. Molly had come to prefer it that way. Perfume belonged to ballrooms, to women who were permitted to move through the world, to the version of herself that no longer existed on any official register. Here, there was only candlelight and the musty exhale of books she had already read twice, and the particular silence that forms when a house decides to forget someone is inside it. She was sitting on the floor beneath the high window, the only window, too tall to climb and too narrow to matter, with a candle burning low on the floorboard beside her and a folded letter across her knees. The letter was 3 weeks old. It was from Sable, slipped beneath the door in the early morning as all communication between them was managed now, and it told her what the rest of the household already knew. Duke Cashin Vorn of Blackmere is coming to Kereth Province. God help the province. Molly had read those 2 sentences 11 times. Not because they frightened her, everything outside this room had become abstract, almost fictional, but because the name Vorn pulled at something in her memory. She had been 16 when the Blackmere Duke crushed the Aldrich Rebellion without a single misstep. She remembered her father reading the dispatch aloud at breakfast, the rare gravity in his voice. "That man sees around corners," he had said, folding the paper, "which means he sees through walls. Which means God help whoever is standing on the wrong side of one." Her father had been dead 4 years now. His estate, her inheritance by every clause of his will, had been absorbed into her stepfather's accounts within 6 months of her confinement. She had been told this by Sable, who had been told by the solicitor's clerk, who had been told to say nothing further. That was 2 years ago. She pressed her thumb against the edge of the letter until the paper bent. The story Kereth Province told about Molly Asheville was tidy and sad and entirely constructed. She had suffered a breakdown at a society dinner, such a shame, the poor girl, and had been removed from public life for her own welfare. Her mother, Countess Marin Asheville, bore it with extraordinary grace. Her physicians confirmed the diagnosis. Her family prayed for her recovery. The true version was less tidy and considerably less sad and went like this. Molly had been 20 years old and seated beside Lord Hewitt Crane at a dinner when she recognized his wife's specific expression, the particular stillness of a woman performing composure over humiliation. She had seen it before, at home, in mirrors, on the faces of women whose husbands did as they pleased. She had looked down the table at her mother and seen on Marin's face the inverse, the brightness of a woman whose pleasure is still a secret. That night after the guests had gone, Molly had said quietly, "Mother, I think you should end it." Marin had gone still in the way that water goes still before it freezes. Within a fortnight, Molly had been described to 3 separate physicians as experiencing episodes of paranoid delusion. Within a month, she was confined. Within 6 months, she had ceased to exist as a legal entity, no registry, no inheritance, no name attached to the world outside this wing. Her mother had not raised her voice once throughout the entire process. It was, Molly had eventually conceded, impressive in the most terrible way. Tonight was different because she could not sleep, and because the book she needed was in the main library, and because Sable had taught her, years ago, that locks were only obstacles to people who respected them. She had been asking for Brennan's Principles of Civic Law for 3 months. It had been denied 3 times, which told her something, that there was something in it her mother did not want her to read, which meant she needed to read it more than she had originally intended. She waited until the second hour past midnight, when the house settled into its deepest silence. Then she took the pin from the hem of her sleeve and worked the lock the way Sable had shown her, patiently, without forcing it, letting the mechanism tell her where its weakness was. The door opened. The corridor was dark and cold and smelled of extinguished candles. She moved through it the way she had learned to move in this house, close to the wall, wait on the outer edge of each step, breathing through her nose. She passed her mother's portrait without looking at it. She passed the closed door of Exilved's chambers and heard, faintly, her half-sister's untroubled sleep. The library was unlocked. It always was. Books presumably were not considered dangerous. She found Brennan's Principles on the third shelf, pulled it free, and tucked it beneath her arm. She allowed herself 10 seconds, a private, ridiculous luxury, to stand in the center of the library and breathe the smell of it. Hundreds of books she had not read, would read someday, when she was out of here. When she turned to leave, the man in the doorway was tall, dressed in a black traveling coat with the dust of a long road still on the shoulders, and he was looking at her with gray eyes that did not widen in surprise. He caught her by the arm, steadying her, when she startled backward. The silence between them lasted exactly 4 seconds. "Who are you?" he asked. His voice was low, unhurried, the voice of someone who had never needed volume to be heard. She looked at him. Then, because 2 years of confinement had stripped away the part of her that performed acceptable answers, she told him the truth. "No one," she said, "according to my family." He looked at her for a long moment, not with pity, not with confusion, but with the precise, unnerving focus of a man recalculating something important. He did not let go of her arm. He released her arm at breakfast. That was how Molly measured it, not by hours, but by the moment the household discovered that Duke Cassian Vorn had arrived in the night, had taken the guest chambers without announcement, and had made, by morning, a single formal request through his second-in-command. All members of the Asheville family were to attend the governor's gathering that afternoon. The word "all" had apparently been underlined in the verbal delivery. Marin came to the East Wing herself, which had not happened in 4 months. She stood in the doorway with her composure arranged perfectly around her and looked at Molly the way she looked at structural problems, assessingly, without feeling. She said, "You will dress plainly. You will speak to no one. If anyone asks, you are my husband's cousin, recovering from a chest ailment. You will answer to the name Clara." Molly said nothing. Marin took that for agreement and left. Sable, appearing 10 minutes later with a gray dress and an expression of controlled fury, whispered, "He asked specifically." His man came to the servants' entrance and asked if there were any family members not accounted for on the household register. She paused, smoothing the dress across the chair. Someone already told him. Molly looked at the gray dress. Then she put it on, because choosing this battle would cost her the ones that mattered. The governor's hall was everything the East Wing was not: warm, overlit, loud, with the particular performance of people who needed to be seen performing. Molly had once moved through rooms like this without effort. Now she felt the noise as a physical thing, pressing at her temples. She found a chair in the corner furthest from the entrance, sat, and opened Brennan's Principles in her lap. It was, she was aware, an unusual choice of reading for a social gathering. That was precisely why she had brought it. She had read 11 pages before she became aware of someone standing beside her chair. She did not look up immediately. She finished the paragraph. "Brennan," said the Duke of Blackmere, reading the spine. He sat in the adjacent chair with the unhurried ease of a man who owned every room he entered by default. "His argument in the 3rd volume is flawed." She looked up then. He was as she remembered from the corridor, gray eyes, economy of expression, the traveling coat exchanged for something darker and better fitted. He looked like a man who found most situations mildly insufficient. "The flaw is intentional," she said. "He builds the weak argument in Volume 3 so that Volume 4's correction lands harder. It's architecture, not error." He was quiet for a moment. "Most people don't reach Volume 4. Most people stop reading when they think they've understood something." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but the shadow of where a smile might eventually be. He asked what she made of the inheritance clauses in the 2nd volume. She told him, in specific and unguarded terms, exactly what she made of them, including which clauses had been historically weaponized against women and how the language permitted it. She had 2 years of thinking and no one to think aloud to. The words came out of her steady and clear, like water that had been pressing against a door finally finding a gap. He listened. Not politely, attentively, with the focused stillness of someone filling in a map. She was mid-sentence when her mother's hand closed around her shoulder. The introduction of Exiled that followed was seamless and practiced. Marin praised her younger daughter's grace, her temperament, her eye for household management. Exiled stood in a pale blue dress and smiled with the effortless beauty of someone who had never had to pick a lock. Cassian rose. He was courteous. He allowed himself to be redirected with the cooperativeness of a man who had already gotten what he came for. Before he turned fully away, he looked back at Molly once. She dropped her eyes to her book. Her hands, hidden beneath it, were trembling not from fear, but from the effort of having been, briefly, entirely herself. Lord Fenwick, Molly learned later through Sable, had spent the following 2 days in the provincial records office, the solicitor's offices, and 3 private conversations with the household physician who had signed her diagnosis. The physician had, apparently, not enjoyed the 3rd conversation. On the 3rd evening, Marin was summoned to the governor's private anteroom for a meeting with the Duke regarding, officially, the social prospects of the Asheville family's younger daughter. She returned 2 hours later and went directly to her chambers without speaking to anyone. Sable found Molly in the East Wing at midnight and told her everything in a low, rapid voice. The itemized account of her mother's fabrications that Cassian had laid before Marin like evidence at a trial. The paid physician. The suppressed will, the false registry removal. He had named each piece calmly in sequence and had then delivered his ultimatum with the same tone a man might use to discuss whether her records restored, her name returned, within 3 days. Or every document bearing Marin's signature goes before the king's court. Sable paused. Then, carefully, he said something else, my lady, about you. Tell me, he said. Sable folded her hands. That you would be his. Those were the exact words. That he does not accept damaged gifts, and so she would first repair what she broke. The East Wing was very quiet. Claimed, Molly said finally, not a question. Yes. She requested a private audience the following morning. He granted it within the hour, which told her something about how seriously he was taking this, or how seriously he took himself. She sat across from him in the governor's study and asked him directly, because directness was the only thing she had left that belonged entirely to her. Is this rescue or acquisition? He was quiet for longer than she expected. Outside, wind moved through the governor's garden. She watched his face and found, disconcertingly, that it was not performing anything. I don't know yet, he said, but I promise you it is not performance. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in 2 years. She did not trust it completely. She did not discard it either. She held it the way you hold something whose weight you haven't yet determined carefully without committing your grip. He stood. 3 days, she said. 2 now, he replied. She signed this morning. The front door of Asheville Manor opened onto pale afternoon light. Molly stood at the threshold with a single bag and Brennan's Principles tucked beneath her arm. Behind her, Marin watched from the foot of the staircase with the expression of a woman swallowing something sharp. Exiled stood 3 steps above her, eyes cast down, fingers laced together. Molly did not look back, not because she felt nothing, but because she had learned in this house that certain doors deserve to close behind you without ceremony. The carriage bearing the Blackmere crest waited in the drive. She walked toward it steadily, in the gray dress, in the pale light, with 2 years of silence finally running out behind her like a tide going out to sea. Blackmere Castle did not look like a prison. That was the first thing Molly noticed, and she noticed it the way you notice the absence of a smell you had been bracing for with relief, and then immediately with suspicion of the relief. The castle was vast and gray-stoned, yes, but its corridors were lit generously. Its staff moved without the hunched quiet of people accustomed to punishment, and her chambers had 3 windows, all of them reachable. She tested the door handle on her first night. It turned freely from the inside. She stood there for a moment with her hand on it, in the dark, feeling something she didn't yet have a name for. Then she went to bed. The library occupied the entire East Wing. She discovered this on her second morning and stopped in the doorway for a long time, recalibrating. Cassian found her there an hour later. seated cross-legged on the floor between two shelves with 4 books open around her and a 5th in her lap. He said nothing about the floor. He stepped over one open book carefully and sat in the chair nearest the window and returned to whatever correspondence he had brought with him. They remained like that for 2 hours without speaking. It was the most comfortable Molly had felt in 2 years. Their formal meetings about her inheritance restoration, the legal filings, the suppressed will being surfaced and authenticated, happened each morning at a table in the study, with Fenwick present and documents between them. These were efficient and clear. Cashin explained each step before it was taken. He did not make decisions about her case without telling her first. She understood that this was deliberate, and she was grateful for it in the precise way you are grateful for something you should never have had to need. The other conversations, the ones that happened in the library, at dinner when Fenwick was absent, during the slow evenings when the castle settled around them, those grew by degrees, the way fires grow when you stop watching them. She learned about Vera on a Tuesday evening in the 4th week. He told her without preamble, which she later understood was the only way he knew how to say true things. His sister, 7 years ago. A husband who had used the same mechanisms, the paid physicians, the signed documents, the social erasure, and had done it faster and more thoroughly than Marin because he had more resources and less conscience. Cashin had been 3 provinces away managing a border dispute the king could not be troubled with personally. By the time the letter reached him and he reached her, Vera was gone. He had not said gone as a euphemism. He had said it as a fact, flat and final, the way you say the name of a wound you have stopped expecting to close. Molly did not offer him comfort. She understood, instinctively, that he had not told her in order to receive it. She said, "She would have been read that same way you read me, in the corridor." "Yes," he said, "and you have been looking ever since." He was quiet for a long moment. "I have been looking for what I missed, what I would recognize now." He looked at her steadily. "I recognized it." She held that. Then she returned to her book and he to his correspondence, and neither of them said anything more that evening. But something had settled between them, a weight set down in a shared place. Marin's final move arrived in the 5th week, dressed as a legal document. New testimony from the same physician, alleging a recent episode of self-harm at Blackmere, fabricated entirely, submitted to a court official in the capital with a signed affidavit. If accepted, it would invoke the incapacity clause, suspending the inheritance restoration proceedings indefinitely. Cashin read the document. His face did not change. That, Molly had learned, meant he was at his most dangerous. He told her he intended to take it directly to the king's court and dismantle it there. She said, "No." He looked at her. "I need to do this," she said. "Not you. If my name is rebuilt by your authority alone, it is your name I'm standing under, not my own. I will not replace one shelter for another." The silence that followed was the most honest silence she had ever sat inside. "It will be harder," he said, not discouraging, informing. "I know what hard looks like," she said. "I have a 2-year education in it." He stepped back. She watched it happen, the deliberate setting aside of his instinct to act, to fix, to cover. It cost him something visible. He stepped back. The tribunal convened on a gray morning in the capital. Molly stood before 3 court assessors in a dark blue dress, the first dress she had chosen herself in 2 years, and did not perform anything. She laid her journals on the table, 27 months of dated, meticulous entries. She walked the assessors through the pattern of her mother's actions in chronological sequence, naming each fabrication by its correct legal term, her voice unhurried and even. When the physician took the stand, she asked him one question. "On what date did you first receive payment from Countess Asheville, and from which account?" The physician went pale. He knew she had the ledger. Fenwick had made certain he knew, and the specific account in question had been used for 2 other transactions that bore their own complications. He did not answer. His silence answered for him. The case collapsed in the afternoon session. Marin lost her social standing, her legal claims, and the Asheville family seat, which had belonged to Molly by her father's will, suppressed for 6 years and now authenticated in full. Exiled submitted a written corroboration, short and plainly worded, that confirmed the central facts. It arrived too late to be necessary. Molly acknowledged it without coldness and without warmth, as you acknowledge a door held open by someone who watched you struggle with it for years. She spent the first week at the restored Asheville estate alone. She walked every room. She stood in the library where her father had read dispatches aloud at breakfast and let the silence there be a different kind of silence, inhabited rather than imposed. She slept in her childhood bed. She sat in the garden at dusk and watched the light leave the ground slowly, without hurry. On the 8th morning, she packed one bag. The Blackmere Library was warm when she entered it, lit by the long amber light of late afternoon. Cashin was at the far table, coat off, working through a document with the focused quiet she had come to know as his natural state. He looked up. She crossed the room without hurrying, set Brennan's Principles on the table across from him, pulled out the chair and sat. "Where were we?" she said. Something in his expression shifted, not quite a smile, but the arrival of one, moving toward the surface at its own pace. "You were telling me I was wrong about Aldrich's third theorem." "I was right about that." "You were," he said, and looked at her with the same gray eyes that had seen her clearly in a dark corridor when she had been, officially, no one. "You usually are." She opened the book. Outside, the light held as long as it could against the evening, and then it did what good things do, it stayed just long enough to matter.